Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this summing up video on poststructuralism. Let us talk about the binaries, reversals, and the deconstructive reading. What exactly they do in doing the deconstruction under poststructuralism. Deconstruction is interested in the hierarchic binaries set up within the texts, as we already discussed many times. These could be man or woman, speech writing, white and black, inside outside, full empty, identity and difference, light and dark, presence absence, similarity difference, and so on. In each of these binaries, one term is privileged over the other, always. A deconstructive reading would show how, even when a text appears to privilege one term over the other, say inside over the outside, the text's logic of rhetoric reveals that there can be no one side without the inside. There can be no inside without the outside. And similarly, there can be no outside within the inside. In other words, deconstruction shows how the less privileged term is central to the dominant term. By showing this centrality, deconstruction reverses the hierarchy. For if the inside can exist only if there is an outside, it means that the outside is the dominant element. In the next stage, deconstruction destabilizes this reversed hierarchy too. It questions the new hierarchy and thus leaves even the displaced one unstable. Thus, the text remains unresolvable whether neither term is privileged and where both terms are privileged, a situation which is normally called as aporia, as we already discussed, where there is no determinacy of meaning. And hence, a Derridian type of reading the texts, say for example, a painting as a text, let us deconstruct it and observe it. Number one, the painting is the figure in the center of the canvas. Agree? Imagine. Number two, it is bounded by a frame. Number three, when we talk about or look at a painting, we only observe the figure in the center. We do not talk about the frame. Observed? Number four, thus the painting privileges the figure over the frame. In the binary figure or frame, the first is the privileged term. Number five, but then the figure is made possible because only the frame limits it. Otherwise, everything would have been the wall. Without the frame, the figure would escape the borders and endlessly proliferate into the wall. The frame also distinguishes it from the surroundings. It marks the painting itself as separate from the wall in which it hangs. Thus, the painting and the figure exist as unique pieces of art on the wall precisely because the frame isolates it as such. Agree with that? Point number six is this means the frame is central to the figure. It is privileged over the figure because there cannot be a figure without a frame. With this, the hierarchy binary of figure over the frame has been reversed. Number one. And the next point, that is the seventh point, is once we establish that the frame is important, we can see how the frame participates in the figure. It is included within the painting as a boundary. The figure assumes the border exists and contains it. The frame limits our vision when we trace the painting with our eyes. The signature of the artist is placed in a particular position, both the figure as well as the frame, and so on. Without the figure, the frame would be without any value, just an empty square. It is the figure that bestows a quality to the frame as something that contains a special feature. In other words, the frame comes into the painting even as the figure extends towards the frame, and we cannot treat the frame as privileged over that of the figure because the figure is what marks the frame as the frame of something. Getting it? The next point, eighth, is with this move, deconstruction shows how neither the frame nor the figure, but both frame and figure are constitutive of each other. That neither can be privileged. And this is undecidable. This undecidability of the painting gives a deconstructive thought. Getting it? Let us summarize that. In a typical deconstructive reading of the text, what we see is a three-part movement in the analysis. What are the three parts? Number one, a text proposes a literal meaning and a hierarchy. Number two, the deconstructive reading reveals a figural meaning and reverses the hierarchy. Number three, it is then displaced. Even the reversed hierarchy also is replaced, leaving the text open, neither here nor there. Got it? So this type of reading is what is called as deconstructive reading. Let us talk about post-structuralism, simulation, and Postmodern. I understand that I have not dealt with postmodernism. The next video is on modern and postmodernism. Listening to the which it will become very clear. But for the time being, in the writings of Baudrillard, Deleuze-Guattari, and Lyotard, these are all postmodern thinkers, which we'll be discussing in the next video. We see a strong post-structuralist stance, a distrust to finalize meaning, a resistance to authoritarian discourses, an emphasis on play, possibilities, and contingency, the here and now rather than forever, and a focus on the tension between the real and the imitation. Mostly associated with postmodern cultural theory and practices, these thinkers have, however, extended the concerns of post-structuralism also about science, meaning, and contexts of meaning production. So it is here that the postmodernism converges with the post-structuralism. Rather, post-structuralism and postmodernism unite to make a new way of thought, which is subversive in the modern context. Now, when we talk about post-structuralism, it obviously talks about a new concept which has been given by Gilles Deleuze and Guattari, which is called as the deterioratorialization. Deterioratorialization, right? A concept that is introduced by Deleuze and Guattari in 2004 to describe the connectivity and endless proliferation of machines, science, and power, the deterritorialization. Could you get it? Captures the postmodern as well as post-structuralist thinking about authority, power, as well as space. The deterritorialization was also used to describe the affect and emotions by Guattari and Deleuze. And that is the reason why we could find that in Deleuze and Guattari, the subject is a site of directionless, unorganized flow of lives, a site of social forces, the territory of the battle between the two, a shifting, evolving, changing site linked together in a rhizomatic semblance. So you have something like rhizophrenia and schizophrenia that Deleuze and Guattari talk. Both Deleuze and Guattari is a classic example, structuralistic notion where the subject is the site of forces rather than stability. You never have one meaning at all. There is always plurality. There is always a rhizome figure. And so, Deleuze and Guattari are essentially concerned with the question of control, regimentation, and limitation, as we saw in Foucault also. Their ideas of lines of flight, desiring nomadic deteriorative realizations are moves towards different ways of thinking itself and shares much with what we call as post-structuralism. And so, post-structuralism and the theory automatically gives rise to the theory of minor literature. What does that mean? Once again, Deleuze and Guattari have been at the forefront in the discussion of subversion and politically significant literature. They begin their classic work on Kafka. Kafka's work like Towards a Minor Literature, 1975, published, by arguing that great literature could be and would be minor because its language would always be foreign, open, and unfinalizable, creative, as well as mutating. You can have thousands of interpretations and you can never have one possible conclusion for any text. Deleuze and Guattari see Kafka as minor because he was a Czech writing in a language not his own and therefore without standards and definitions. This openness to change, to possibilities and becoming constitutes great literature. Language, they argue, is not associated with a body or a person, but is collective and dispersed. It is, in other words, deterioratorialized. Deterioratorialized. When it becomes associated with a particular person, event, or context, it becomes rhetoritorialized. Now, it can never happen. A text always will have many interpretations. For example, we can think of Toni Morrison and Alice Walker as writers of minor literature. They refused to accept the identities that were readily available to them. Blacks in America, for instance. Instead, they set about trying to find a new form of expression that would invent new identities like blacks, like women, like lesbian, like marginal, and so on. The turn to oral traditions and storytelling formats by Aboriginal writers in Australia and Canada is again a search for a form that can invent new identities rather than simply accept the ready made ones. In all these cases, the significance has been seen to black, inverted commas, mein, Aboriginal, or woman, not as a fixed identity, but as a process, a series of negotiations with other identities like whites, the males, and so on. There is nothing proper, no standard identity in any of these authors. That's why they say nothing that is pre-given is acceptable. That's a very interesting notion for um, post-structuralism. Nothing that is pre-given is acceptable. If we were to reduce this complex notion of minor literature to its basic assumptions, then we can say that any writing that refuses to provide a unified, definitive identity, but focuses on escapes, flows, deterioraalization, unfinalizability, and becoming would become minor literature. A literature that studies differences, deviations, variations, and possibilities rather than fixed, stable identities, and seeks evolution rather than finished product would be the minor literature. Minor literature adopts other forms, steals from multiple sources, creates disruptive images. Toni Morrison's ghosts, for example, and thus refuse a definite type. And so, post structuralism in the late 20th century, some forms of science fiction that refuses easy binaries of man and woman, human and animal, would be minor literature, which would be the examples that include the white male writer, William Gibson, or maybe the black woman writer like Octavia Butler, and so on. A host of writers are there in the 21st century belonging to post structuralist minor literature. Thus, post structuralism does not have to be by and about minorities, but each one of us is minor. Whoever is deviating and trying to say something new, trying to say something in a subvertive way, trying to say something in a not acceptable way, are all minorities and post structuralist in their writings. Thank you very much for being a part of this video on post structuralism. Let's meet in the next video. Bye for now.